Hi, my name is Valerie Leonard, and I am your facilitator for this presentation to the YMEN Board of Directors and Staff. We are in preparation for your board retreat that will take place on Tuesday, December 18th. And the slides have been adapted from two presentations, the first of which is the essentials of board governance, and that was a presentation that was done by Fran Wittenberg Alvis. And then the second one is from one of my presentations, Building Effective Boards, and that was developed as part of the Capacity Building Blocks series of workshops that I designed. And the goal here was to pull out some salient lessons for you that we thought would be most, of most interest to the organization given where you are in your development. So I want to give you a little bit of information about me. My name is Valerie Leonard, and I focus on community and organizational development. I have recently founded nonprofit Utopia, and that's the ideal community for emerging leaders. We work with emerging leaders to help them build their capacity to then develop their organizations into sustainability. You can learn more about Nonprofit Utopia at nonprofitutopia.com or nonprofitutopia.mn.co. I also teach online courses in operations management, program development, financial management, and proposal development for UIC's Certificate in Nonprofit Management program. I've also developed Capacity Building Blocks, which is a 10-week workshop series focusing on a number of nonprofit issues, and that includes things like how do you start a nonprofit organization that's tax exempt, board development, finance, and compliance. And I'm also the host of Nonprofit Utopia Internet Radio Show on blogtalkradio.com, and this is a forum where nonprofit stakeholders can share lessons learned in the industry. We come on live on Mondays at 2 o'clock on blogtalkradio.com/nonprofit utopia. We've got a lot to cover today. We will be talking about the definition of board governance. We'll be looking at the roles and responsibilities of a board, and we'll talk about the stages in a nonprofit board's life cycle. We'll also talk about the types of boards, issues that you might come into when you transition from a working board to a governing board, and even sometimes you're a little bit between those phases, which I think is where you are. And then we'll talk about the common problems associated with boards and how they might be addressed. So what is governance? Governance means to steer. It means to set direction. And when we talk about boards, not only are we steering and setting direction, we're also talking about a structure for making decisions. Nonprofit organizations are governed by a volunteer board of directors who are the legal guardians of the organization. So they're not necessarily owned by individuals, they're owned by the community, and they're governed by the board. And the board is granted the authority to make decisions on behalf of the organization and must be accountable for organization performance. And when we talk about accountability, we should be talking about accountability to all stakeholders. We're looking at accountability to the board, accountability to our funders, accountability to regulators, accountability to staff, the people who work for us, accountability to the community. So what are some of the characteristics of boards? First of all, board authority is collective. That means as a group, you all have authority. Individual members have no authority, and the president or the board chair is the elected spokesperson for the board. Nonprofit boards basically have three major legal duties. The first one is the duty of care, and board members are legally required to act with reasonable care while making decisions and taking action on the organization's behalf. While making decisions, board members need to be informed of alternatives that could impact the outcomes. They should discuss pros and cons and strive to minimize the risk for the organization. So as you deliberate, you should make sure you have as much information in front of you and not be a rubber stamp. The second legal duty is the duty of loyalty or fiduciary responsibility. Board members are required to put the interest of the organization ahead of their own interest. There should be no self-dealing, and there should be no conflicts of interest. When we talk about self-dealing, we're talking about benefiting, personally from the organization. So, for example, a board member voting to rent an office space in a building he or she owns. And, that might not be so bad, as long as you disclose it and as long as you are in the market looking for, comparable deals. The problem comes when you have a number of board members or even just one board member who continue to make deals, amongst themselves at the expense of the organization, to the point where it looks like they are enriching themselves more so than the organization. So that's something you got to be really, really careful about, because the IRS has indeed revoked IRS tax exemption from organizations that seem to be enriching their board members and or their families at the expense of the organization. Another thing you should be concerned about is conflicts of interest. So an example of that is when a board member is sitting on the boards of two organizations that have similar missions and they're going after the same funding source. And if they're going after the same funding source at the same time, obviously that board member is going to have divided loyalties. He wants to make sure that both organizations succeed, but at some point there could potentially be a conflict of interest and competition for his or her loyalty. The next one is the duty of obedience, and that tells us that nonprofit boards must ensure that the organization obeys applicable laws and regulations, follows its own bylaws, and adheres to its stated corporate purpose and mission. With respect to board roles and responsibilities, we see that the board roles differ somewhat from the staff roles. Basically, the board governs the organization and sets strategic direction, while staff is the legs. They manage the day-to-day operations. The key roles of the board include determining and articulating the mission and purpose of the organization, setting organizational direction, and that includes strategic planning, providing oversight of finances, the executive director, programs and services, ensure adequate resources, and that includes financial and human resources, and finally, enhancing the agency's public standing. When we look at the board's responsibility to the mission, we see that one of the first responsibilities is defining the organization in both the present and the future. When we look at the present, we're looking at what we do now, and the future is looking at what results we want to achieve or what are the outcomes. The board should also approve or affirm the mission. The board should approve or affirm the key goals that will result in mission accomplishment or vision actualization. And the board should ensure that operating plans and strategies actually lead to the attainment of these goals, and all other responsibilities flow from and depend upon the fulfillment of the mission. The board also has responsibility to leadership. They select and support the individual empowered to lead the organization. Boards must reach consensus on the chief executive's job description and undertake a careful search process to find the most qualified individual for the position. The board supports the executive director and reviews his or her performance. The board should ensure that the chief executive has the moral and professional support he or she needs to further the goals of the organization, and it's the responsibility of the executive to transform the mission from concept to action and measurable outcomes. The board also has responsibility to the financial health of the organization. This includes formulating policies regarding financial reporting and controls, control and reporting of contributions and donations, and financial auditing. The board selects an independent auditor and reviews and approves the audit report. The board also approves financial investments and financing choices. The board monitors and appraises revenues, expenditures, and cash position of the organization, and they ensure compliance with board financial policies. One of the board's foremost responsibilities is to provide adequate resources for the organization to fulfill its mission. The board should work in partnership with the chief executive and the development staff, if any, to raise funds from the community. The board has accountability to the public, and that includes assisting in the development of the annual budget and ensuring that the proper financial controls are in place. And the annual budget could include the operating budget as well as the capital budget and any budgets for special projects. They must remain accountable to the organizational donors and the general public, and in so doing, the board must safeguard its tax-exempt status and maintain compliance with state, federal, and local regulating agencies. The board is responsible for the operations, and that doesn't mean that they necessarily manage the day-to-day operations. However, they have to formulate policies that regard personnel, facilities, maintenance, safety, financial controls, and other legal requirements of the operating entity. They have to approve all policies formulated by management that involve legal, regulatory, or external issues, and they appraise and audit operations to ensure that compliance with the board operating policies are met. Boards determine, monitor, and strengthen the organization's programs and services. So the board's role in this area is to determine which programs are the most consistent with the organization's mission and to monitor their effectiveness. So the board also enhances the organization's public standing. An organization's primary link to the community, including constituents, the public, and the media, is the board. The board must clearly articulate the organization's mission, accomplishments, and goals to the public, and garnering support from important members of the community are important elements of a comprehensive public relations strategy. The board should use social media such as Facebook and Twitter with filters on at all times. The board is also responsible for the organization and its development. In so doing, they have to formulate policies regarding board member selection and expectations, board member orientation, board development, board committee assignments, board planning, and performance evaluation. The board approves bylaws and amendments. They select board members, they elect board officers, they approve board committee appointments, board work plan, and the annual board budget. And again, this includes the capital budgets as well. They develop a board information system to provide the information needed to carry out the board's oversight role. And they not only appraise the performance of the executive, but they appraise their own performance, and that includes individual board members as well as the board as a whole. So why are bylaws so important? Bylaws are important because that's exactly what they are. They are by law. They are a legal requirement, they're legally binding, and each state has a minimum standard of the contents of the bylaws. So the bylaws need to be developed in accordance with the individual state codes. And this includes provisions governing the structure and internal policies and procedures of the organization, and they outline the board's operations, and they're unique to each organization, so no two organizations have the same exact bylaws. And they should be reviewed regularly, at least, at a minimum every few years. I want to share a couple tips for drafting bylaws. First of all, make sure the bylaws are in compliance with current state law, yet serve the organization's desires to operate in an efficient manner. So they have to offer some flexibility as well. You should pay special attention to the more important bylaw provisions such as quorum requirements. And when we talk about quorums, we're talking about the minimum number of people who need to be present in order to transact business. They should also include succession of officers, power of the executive committee, and the voting rules. And these are basic things that they should include. So I want to talk a little bit about risk mitigation. And when we talk about risk mitigation, that just talks about reducing the level of risk to the organization and ultimately risk to the board members who are legally responsible for everything that goes on in the organization. So one of the ways you can reduce risk is to have directors and officers insurance, and this protects the directors and officers, including board members, from any liabilities that could stem from potential lawsuits that are against the organization. Because again, the members of the board are legally liable for whatever happens, and if there are not sufficient assets covered by the corporation, then people can in fact go after the board of directors individually as well. So it's always prudent to have what we call D&O insurance, directors and officers insurance, to protect the interests of not only the organization but the individual members. It also makes it more attractive for members to serve. Boards should have a financial audit. They should have a legal audit. And when we talk about the legal audit, we're talking about looking at the policies and procedures to make sure that they pass legal muster. We're also talking about making sure that the organization has properly filed its filings with the state of Illinois, and if you're in another state, it could be another state. Anything that you need to file with the IRS, such as a Form 990, anything that you need to file with the Secretary of State's office, and if there are any other filings that might be associated with any legal documents that you have, be it a grant agreement, be it contracts, etc., etc. It's always good to have a lawyer to review those and make sure that to the extent possible you can mitigate risk to the organization. You should also have a process for determining reasonable yet competitive compensation for the CEO and executive director, and make sure that you have a conflict of interest policy and annual disclosure in place. Make sure that there's a whistleblower policy in place and a document retention policy. The board should recruit and orient new board members and assess board performance. All boards have a responsibility to articulate and make known their needs in terms of member experience, skills, and many other considerations that define a quote-unquote balanced board composition. Boards must also orient new board members to their responsibilities and the organization's history, needs, and challenges. By evaluating its performance and fulfilling its responsibilities, the board can recognize its achievements and reach consensus on areas that need to be improved. So let's talk about board evaluation. When it comes to the mission, can each board member quote the mission? Do you have an elevator speech? Is it reviewed annually? And when we talk about is it reviewed annually, we're talking about the mission. Are you looking at your mission annually to see if it's still relevant, if it needs to be tweaked given the current environment? So let's talk more about board evaluation and what makes for productive meetings. First of all, you want to know or ask yourself, are board meetings productive? Are the agenda and reports distributed prior to the meeting in order to allow for full review? Is there a board attendance policy in place and followed? And not only is it followed, is it enforced? Is the bulk of meetings spent on important issues? Are board members actively engaged in the meeting? Do they do homework between the meetings? And is there a standardized committee report form that all board members can use? Now ask yourself these questions. Does your organization have a board member and committee job descriptions? Is there good understanding of the division of labor between the board and staff? Do people understand the differences between the roles of board and staff? Is there a matrix of strengths and needs for board recruitment? And is there new board member orientation? Now let's move on to fundraising and membership. Is there a written development or membership plan or both? Do all board members make a personal contribution to the agency? And this can be in-kind contributions, this can be cash contribution, it can be contributions in terms of time and commitment. Is there a give or get policy, meaning if there's not money that they can raise, is there money they can give if they can't raise it within their network? And how do members with limited means contribute to fundraising? At this point, we want to look at the board's role in management oversight. Is the CEO or executive director evaluated annually? Is there an annual compensation analysis to make sure that the CEO is being paid, fairly, within the market? Is there a succession plan? Are policies reviewed and approved on a regular basis? And is that documented by a board vote and a certification by the secretary? Is there a clear understanding between the roles and responsibilities of board versus staff? Do you have a strategic plan in place? Is the plan still relevant? Is it current? Does it still support the mission? And how often do you review it just to make sure that the organization is still being responsive to the needs of the community? So now let's look at the individual board member responsibilities. Individual board members should attend all board and committee meetings and functions, such as special events. They should be informed about the organization's mission, services, policies, and programs. They should review the agenda and supporting materials prior to board meetings and committee meetings. They should serve on committees and offer to take on special assignments as needed. And they should make a personal financial contribution to the organization. Board members should also inform others about the organization, that is, serve as ambassadors to the organization. They should suggest possible nominees to the board who can make significant contributions to the work of the board and the organization. They should keep up to date on developments in the organization's field so that they can keep the organization informed as to what's happening. They should follow the conflict of interest and confidentiality policies, and any policy for that matter. They should refrain from making special requests of the staff. They should assist the board in carrying out its fiduciary responsibilities, such as reviewing the organization's monthly, quarterly, and/or annual financial statements and approving the annual budget. So why have committees in the first place? First of all, you want to establish committees when issues are too complex or time-consuming to be handled by the entire board. And for ongoing major activities, you should establish standing committees. For short-term activities or temporary activities, you should establish ad hoc committees that cease when the activities are completed. And standing committees should be included in the bylaws, and committees recommend policy for approval by the entire board. Okay, so at this point, we want to talk about characteristics of effective committees. Committees make full use of board members' expertise, time, and commitment, and ensure diversity of opinions are expressed on the board. They don't supplant responsibility of each board member. However, they do operate at the board level and not at the staff level. Committees may meet monthly, and this is typical of new organizations, or they can meet every 2 months or every 3 months. And if meetings are not held monthly, then the meetings should attempt to be held between the full board meetings. Minutes should be recorded for all board meetings and for the executive committee meetings if the bylaws indicate the executive committee can make decisions in place of the board when needed. So there are quite a few things we need to consider when developing committees. First of all, ensure that the committee has a specific set of tasks to address and ensure that the board members understand the committee's charge. There should be at least 2 board members on each committee, and no board member should be on more than 2 committees, just to make sure that people are not stretched too thin. And the only exception for this, there are 2 exceptions. One would be the board president, and the other would be the executive director. In many cases, these 2 positions serve on all committees as ex officio members. And when I say ex officio, I am meaning that because they are in such and such a position, and in this case because they are the board president or board chair, or because they are the executive director, they hold this position, and it's not because they are such and such a person. At each board meeting, each committee chair should report the committee's work since the last board period, and you should consider having non-board volunteers as members of the committee, and this is a very common practice, and it's a very good way to source new board members, and then when you bring them on, they will have already been familiar with the board's work because they have been working actively on the committees. Consider having a relevant staff member as a member of the committee. And the jury is out on this one, and there are 2 schools of thought. One school of thought says that you should not have the chair of the board being a part of a committee because he or she has his hands full being the chair of the whole organization. But then there's another school of thought that says the board chair or board president should in fact be an ex officio member of all committees. So it depends on what the preference of the organization is. And committee chairs are often appointed by the board chair, so consider asking committee members for a volunteer to chair the committee. And the chief executive should serve as ex officio members of the board and any relevant committees. So some organizations might consider placing the chief executive as a member of the board, and this includes having voting rights. Some say that they can be an ex officio member of the board without voting rights, and that needs to be weighed very carefully, depending on your own circumstances and needs. So let's talk more about the executive committee. Typically, by law, the executive committee has all of the power and authority of the full board with the following exceptions. They can't fill board vacancies, they cannot adopt, amend, or repeal bylaws, and they cannot have powers that are inconsistent with the resolutions passed by the board. And the reason why you might want to use an executive committee is, from time to time, there may be business that comes up that requires a hasty decision, and there may not be enough time to pull the whole board together. And in this case, you might lean upon the executive committee to, in fact, act on behalf of the whole board. So let's look at some of the typical standing or permanent committees. One such committee is the Board Development Committee. And the Board Development Committee ensures the effective board processes are in place. They make sure that there are structures and roles, including retreat planning, committee development, and board evaluation. So they're looking at how the entire board runs, and they also work with individual board members to evaluate their performance. And sometimes this includes the role of a nominating committee and keeping a list of potential board members and orientation and training. The executive committee oversees operations of the board, and they often act on behalf of the board during on-demand activities that occur between meetings, and these acts are later presented for full board review, and they're comprised of the board chair, other officers such as the vice president, secretary and treasurer, and other committee chairs sometimes, or just whomever the organization deems should be a part of this committee. And sometimes it's just the officers, sometimes they might expand it to beyond the officers. And although this might be too small, they often perform evaluation of the chief executive. In some organizations, they have the full board to evaluate the chief executive. Another standing committee is the Finance Committee, and the Finance Committee oversees development of the budget. They ensure accurate tracking and monitoring and accountability for funds. They ensure adequate financial controls, and this committee is often led by the board treasurer, and they review major grants and associated terms. The Fundraising Committee oversees the development and implementation of the fundraising plan, and this fundraising plan really should be done in coordination with the financial plan or the budget to make sure that there's consistency. And the fundraising committee also identifies and solicits funds from external sources of support, working with the development officer if available, and sometimes this is called the development committee. The marketing committee oversees development and implementation of the marketing plan, and this will include things like identifying potential markets and their needs, how to meet those needs with products, services, and programs that the organization would offer, and how to promote and sell programs through many channels, and this includes social media, word of mouth, etc., etc. Another standing committee is the Personnel Committee, and the Personnel Committee guides the development, review, and authorization of personnel policies and procedures. And they sometimes lead the evaluation of the chief executive. Sometimes they assist the chief executive with leadership and management matters. And a word of caution, do not be confused with managing personnel. The Personnel Committee does not manage personnel. The only person that the board manages is the chief executive. The Public Relations Committee represents the organization to the community. This means enhancing the organization's image, including communications with the press. And often this role is assigned to the CEO and or related individuals or whomever he or she might designate. So when we talk about ad hoc committees, we're talking about a temporary committee, a committee that exists for a specific purpose, and then when the task is complete, they choose to disband. And this is basically a task force within the board. So for example, you might have an audit committee, a nominating committee, an executive search committee, a research and evaluation committee, special event committee, etc., etc. So the things that these committees have in common is they're put together for a specific purpose for a specific period of time, and then they disband. I want to talk about tips for keeping good board members. One way to keep good board members is to make sure that you uniformly and strictly enforce attendance rules. This makes for an environment where there's no preferential treatment. You should only re-elect board members who have fulfilled their duties. Follow up with board members who have missed meetings, and thank board members for their involvement. Do it the Chicago way, early and often. Let's look at the board officers at this point. There is usually a president or a chairman, vice president or vice chair, secretary, and a treasurer. Comprise the executive committee. The president presides over meetings and sets the agenda. He usually works with the executive director to do this. He appoints committees. He manages the executive director. And some boards have the entire board managing the executive director. And the president also serves as the spokesperson for the organization. The vice president fills in for the board in his or her absence, and he assumes the role of president if the role becomes vacant. As you can see, the board secretary has an extremely important job. They're responsible for ensuring that accurate minutes of the meetings are taken and approved and saved, right? They ensure that the records of the organization are maintained as required by law and made available when required by an authorized person. So that means minutes, people have the right to come and inspect your minutes in your office. That also includes Form 990s, AG 990s, which are the state version of the 990, any public record. They also ensure that the official records are maintained, and these are records of the members as well as the organization and the board. They ensure that there is an up-to-date copy of the bylaws that's going to be available for all meetings. From time to time, you need to refer to bylaws, and the secretary is the one who brings one copy of the bylaws to the meetings in the event that there's a question about any rules, any laws of the organization. The secretary manages the general correspondence of the board of directors. He or she participates in board meetings as a voting member and provides items for the agenda as appropriate. They may be designated by the board of directors and or bylaws as one of the signing officers for certain documents, and they may be the registered agent with respect to the laws of the jurisdiction. So in many instances, we see that the executive director is the registered agent, the one to whom all legal notices are sent, but it's not uncommon for the secretary to serve in that role as well. So the last office is the Office of Treasurer. The treasurer keeps track of the nonprofit's funds. They handle bank transactions. They sign checks or co-sign checks with the president. They prepare financial reports to the board and regulatory agencies, and they manage the Finance and Budget Committee. So when it comes to managing the board, one of the conversations that frequently comes up is terms and term limits. Should we have term limits or should we not? The terms and term limits should be spelled out in the organization's bylaws, and the advantages to term limits are they keep the organization leadership fresh, and it encourages a sense of urgency to complete certain initiatives within a certain time frame. The disadvantages to term limits include the fact that leadership continuity could be interrupted, particularly when you're in the middle of a large project. Say if you're in the middle of a capital campaign or some other long-term project where it's really not to your advantage to switch horses in the middle of the race, so to speak. When it comes to managing the board, board should develop written descriptions for each office, member, and committee head. They should create work plans to carry out goals and objectives. They should develop performance expectations and removal policies and enforce them. And they should also establish a board development committee for ongoing training and management of the board. I want to share tips for keeping good board members. First of all, consider asking prospective recruits to serve in an advisory capacity before extending an offer of full membership. This could be serving on an advisory board, or it could be serving on one of the board committees alongside with the board members. That gives the board members an opportunity to see, what the skill sets are and whether or not the person fits in with the organization. And it also gives the prospective recruit an opportunity to see whether or not this is in fact a good fit for them and if they want to increase their commitment to becoming a board member. And you should always require new board members to participate in an orientation. One of the worst feelings in the world is to come into a new situation without an orientation, not knowing what's going on, not knowing what your role is, not knowing the subtle nuances of what you can and cannot do. And when board members don't go through this type of process, the likelihood of them leaving is pretty much increased. You should plan activities for ongoing development so that board members are continually growing with the organization. You should organize a board development committee to train new board members, monitor their attendance, and evaluate participation and fit within their roles. You should give board members specific projects tied to goals and achievements, and you should keep board meetings productive and interesting. I want to talk about the board life cycle, and this information is from Carter McNamara. He's a PhD and he developed a field guide to developing and operating your nonprofit board. So according to Carter McNamara, the board life cycle is in three parts. First of all, you're an organizing board when you are starting out, and then you become a governing board, and then you grow on to be an institutional. So there are two major types of organizing boards. The first type is the organizing board that follows the leader. The second type of organizing board leads or controls the organization. So when we look at the organizing boards that follow the leader, we see that they're normally small. They're often homogeneous, meaning that people tend to be from the same backgrounds. Oftentimes this is the same racial background, socioeconomic background, same school, same community, etc., same thought processes in place. So they're often homogeneous and they tend to be close associates of the leader. Members join to support the leader, and that leader is usually the founder, who tends to have a big vision and he's very passionate about a cause, and the board meetings tend to be informal. On the other hand, we have organizing boards that lead or control the organization, and these are usually a small group of willing workers working cooperatively for a cause. And again, they're often homogeneous and tend to be close, and they have similar mindsets. They tend to have a strong sense of ownership, and board meetings again tend to be informal. All members tend to participate in fundraising, and the group typically grows faster than the follow the leader boards because they're not necessarily building around a single personality. They're all bought into the vision and they see this as a collective, and they all seem to have a stake in the growth of the organization, and they work to make sure that it grows. Now, some of the common issues with follow the leader type boards, organizing boards, is we have founder syndrome. The founding leader tends to be autocratic and not always open to others' opinions, and this does not always happen in every organization, but this is very, very common. They find it very difficult to get work done effectively, and members tend to not be task oriented, and typically the members are selected based on their relationship with the leader rather than skill or passion for the organization. Members tend to rubber stamp decisions made by the leaders, and members usually don't participate in fundraising. So let's talk about the common issues surrounding the organizing the boards that lead. So one of the ticklish situations is the blurring of lines between the board and staff roles and responsibilities, particularly when the board is performing functions to help out, right? So these board members, they're serving as part of the governing board, but at the same time, they serve as staff volunteers. So as members of the governing board, they have responsibility for supervising the executive director. However, as staff volunteers, they are being supervised by the executive director. So this can be a very, very tricky relationship, and the executive director wants to make sure that he doesn't do anything to tick off the board members who are also volunteering and doing work for him, because at some point, those people can come back and evaluate him. And if something goes wrong in the course of that volunteer work, as staff volunteers, then that can be problematic when it comes to evaluating the executive director. Another characteristic of some boards that lead is they love the work that they do. They really love doing hands-on work, so much to the point that they typically delay hiring decisions. The members may feel that hiring staff may somehow take away from their tasks, and members may want the jobs themselves but are reluctant to make a choice for fear of causing friction within the board. And then board members are reluctant to share their power with the staff. So that can also be a very, very delicate. So when it comes to transitioning to a volunteer governing board, you need to develop the board to accommodate growth. You need to bring on new board members with additional skill sets and resources. For example, fundraising, program development, legal and financial expertise. You need a more formalized structure, for example, more committees and more work groups. You also need a more formalized system. For example, strategic planning, budgeting, and program evaluation. Those should be part of your system as you develop your organization and position it for growing to the next stage. One of the most important things you need to do is to clarify the roles between the board and the staff. Members of the Follow the Leader board may have difficulty taking ownership of new tasks, while members of the board that leads may have difficulty actually delegating or relinquishing responsibilities for staff functions. Staff from organizations with either type of board may resent board members being quote-unquote hands-on. And when I talk about staff, I'm talking about not only the executive director, but other people within the organization performing other management functions. Another challenge of transitioning to a volunteer governing board is change management. You need to manage cultural change brought about by bringing on new people and systems while remaining true to the mission. Often during this time of change, if you're not careful, there's a lot of board turnover, and this is normal. It doesn't always feel good, but it is normal. And there is often an entrenchment of quote-unquote old ideas versus quote-unquote fresh ideas. It's very important to establish trusting relationships between quote-unquote the old guard and new members. And you need to make sure that all board members remain actively engaged. You need to make sure that programs remain relevant to the community and potential funders. So balancing all of this is very, very delicate. So some of the tools that you can use are a strategic planning process, board recruitment and orientation, and make sure that you have a really strong package to support that process. You might consider doing some team building. Consider also developing a board development committee, and it's really important to focus on those job descriptions and make sure that there's sign off from the board members to make sure that they understand what it is that is expected of them, and making sure too that they're willing to indeed do what is expected. So there are a number of other issues that come about as you transition to a volunteer governing board. And some of these could come about as a result of communication, and others can come about as a result of board operations. So for example, under communications, there could potentially be hidden agendas, and this happens when people are not forthright in their communication about what their intention is for their stated actions. In other cases, you can have conflict because one member makes a controversial public statement while representing the organization, and that causes headaches for the entire organization. Because remember, as a board, you're not speaking as an individual, you're speaking for the group, and that has consequences for the whole group. So some of the tools that you can use for hidden agendas include encouragement for open and honest communication, and being able to address issues directly without making personal attacks. You focus on issues to get to a deeper meaning of what it is that people are saying and doing. Another tool is disclosure statements, and this comes when you have conflicts of interest and you want to make sure that not only are you addressing conflicts of interest, but it could potentially address hidden agendas. Everything is out in the open. When you have transparency, you are less likely to have a bunch of confusion around conflicts of interest and hidden agendas. And as it relates to communication in the public space, make sure that you have a communication policy that covers not only what you speak in public, but also speaks about how you handle the media and who should speak with the media and under what circumstances. So make sure that the board is trained in those policies as well as the staff. Now, as it relates to board operations, there is a tendency sometimes to get stuck on old business. And one remedy for this is a consent agenda. And you can use a consent agenda by lumping, routine matters that come up every month on your agenda, put them all under one agenda item, and then approve that under one action rather than those 3 or 4 actions. Another problem is recruiting and retaining good board members. And one way to address this issue is to make sure not only that you recruit the board members, but you orient them and you provide a strong orientation package and then onboard them in such a way that they really feel acclimated to the new environment. You can also develop a nominating and/or board development committee so that you maintain stronger relations and stronger development of the board members, and you can increase the capacity where capacity seems to be lacking. Or even if you have a strong board with strong skills, it can never ever be a problem if you engage in continuous development. That keeps the organization moving forward. And another way you can keep and retain good board members is to evaluate the board members, evaluate their engagement, evaluate their performance, and be prepared to take corrective action in the event that you see the engagement or the performance is lacking. Another issue is very, very common, comes under ethics. And one of the first things that we talk about, even from the time we develop our organization, is conflicts of interest. Addressing the conflicts of interest, disclosing them, and mitigating them, and hopefully get to the point where you're avoiding them altogether. Another problem is engagement in partisan political activities. As you know, nonprofit organizations are forbidden to engage in partisan political activities. It's okay to engage in political activities as long as they're nonpartisan. So understanding the nuances and the rules and regulations that IRS has around political involvement is very, very important. And then there's often the pressure to hire friends, relatives, or board members, or associates of funders and others with influence. So some of the ways that you can address these ethical issues are obviously to have a conflict of interest policy in place. Make sure that people read it and sign it. Make sure that there is annual disclosure. And if it gets to the point where it looks like there could be a situation of self-dealing, make sure that you address that issue head on. You should also have a statement of ethics. You should have bylaws and policies in place that talk about conflicts of interest, and have policies that talk about political activities, and personnel policies and procedures that will all deal in some form or fashion with the conflicts of interest. When it comes to fundraising, there's often difficulty in getting board members to participate in fundraising, and some of the ways that you can get them engaged would include developing a board orientation packet that actually has a board job description with expectations about fundraising and engagement. And you want to share also your articles in the bylaws concerning fundraising, have fundraising policies and procedures in place so people understand their roles in terms of fundraising. And you also want to demystify fundraising, because often when you speak of fundraising, that really strikes a chord of fear within the hearts of many board members, particularly board members who don't have these extensive networks, or board members who have limited means. There needs to be ongoing education so that this fundraising issue is, demystified. It's not some mystical thing that, comes to us from on high. So the more education around that, the more engagement around fundraising, the better for the organization. Another common challenge with the board, transitioning from an organizing board to a volunteer governing board, is the lack of financial accountability. And I'm not saying that that is a problem with YMEN. In fact, I know it's not a problem because I've been knowing YMEN for the longest, and that financial accountability has never, ever, ever been an issue. So I'm not speaking to YMEN on this issue, but this is a very common issue, especially as boards transition to their next level of development. In so many instances, they don't have the proper procedures in place that will provide accountability, that will provide for separation of duties between the board and staff, between the treasurer and the staff person who is responsible for putting together the financials. And there's often a problem with regulatory compliance, meaning that often organizations don't file their Form 990s in time, and if you fail to file for 3 years in a row, you can actually lose tax exempt status. So that's a critical issue among many, many organizations, and it's more common than one might think. And some of the tools that you might use are obviously financial policies and procedures. But it's not just enough to have financial policies and procedures. Those financial policies and procedures need to also outline separation of duties between the treasurer and his or her management counterpart who is assisting in the financial management. So there should be separation of duties, but at several levels of the financial management process to make sure no one person has control over the entire process. That minimizes the chances of fraud. You should also have a finance and budget committee who will pour over the finances and then make a financial report to the board. And remember that just because you have a financial committee, that does not absolve board members who are not part of that financial committee from their fiduciary responsibility of being good stewards over the finances. So as a board member, regardless of whether or not you prepare the financials, regardless of whether or not you're on a financial committee, you are legally liable for the finances of the organization. Ignorance is not an excuse. So the next stage of development is the Policy Governing Board. At this stage, the board chairman and executive director, they begin to be seen more as a joint leadership team, and the board members begin to become less involved in day-to-day operating activities. They assume more responsibility for governance, and they're more involved with big picture activities, and that includes setting the strategic direction, financial oversight, and program evaluation. And finally, there is the institutional board. So an institutional board is usually developed once the organization becomes very mature. All systems are in place to run the organization in a very efficient manner. And if the systems are running properly, the organization can really run on autopilot. It doesn't matter if the chief executive leaves or not, the system will go on. These boards are usually larger than typical boards, and they often include civic leaders who are very prominent in the city or in the region. And the major focus is on fundraising. And they delegate many of the governance functions to an executive or management committee. So that concludes the presentation. I know it took a while, but I hope this was worth your time and effort, and I hope that this is helpful as you go through the case study. I look forward to meeting you in person on Tuesday, and you take care. Bye-bye.